Les Roberts, you've also come in for criticism from a group called Iraq Body Count. Now, Iraq Body Count are very much opposed to the war in Iraq, and they're a group of volunteers who keep a record based on public sources of reported deaths in Iraq. Their figure of the current number of deaths is around 50,000. In other words, it's less than 10% of your figure. How do you explain that discrepancy?
So they started out by culling through newspaper reports and trying to record all of those events that appeared in two different media sources. And after a while, they managed to get some reporters to intentionally go visit the morgue in Baghdad and other places. But first of all, that sort of passive surveillance process is never complete in a time of war. In Bosnia, the best estimate is that 30 to 40% of deaths were captured by hospitals plus morgues plus all the governmental reporting systems. But usually in times of war, it's far, far lower. So that's thought number one. Thought number two is, if Iraq was the healthiest country in the world, just no violence, no troubles at all, there have to have been, by this point, about 500,000 deaths from natural causes since the U.S.-led invasion in March of 2003. So if there's been 500,000 deaths from natural causes, what fraction of those have been reported by the Ministry of Health and are captured by hospitals and morgues? And it's not a tenth. It's a tiny fraction. And this actually leads, in my mind, to the most interesting thing about our study. This is probably, of any major scientific study in recent history, whether Dolly the sheep was cloned or whether there was cold fusion, this is the easiest one for the press to either debunk or verify. Because if Iraqi body count is correct, if you go out to the graveyards and morgues across Iraq, only 1 in 10 bodies coming in must be from violence, and 90% must be from natural causes. If we're right, the majority of bodies over the last 3 years that have come in must have been from violence. And it would be pretty darn easy to go to 4 or 5 or 6 places across Iraq and get a quick pulse on whether or not it's a tenth of all deaths that are from violence or most of all deaths that are from violence.
The Iraq Body Count also point to another bit of research done by the United Nations, which surveyed more than 20,000 households. Now, they too came up with much lower figures for violent deaths than your smaller survey.
Yeah, so let's back up. Virtually all of the criticisms you've just mentioned, coming from various groups in and around Oxford, are actually the same group criticizing. And this one is by far the most disingenuous because that survey that you cite was done by a great researcher out of Norway, and it wasn't a survey about mortality. It was a survey about living conditions, and they asked a whole host of questions. The average interview, I believe, took 82 minutes. There was one question about death. If someone had died, then there was a couple follow-on questions. And they found in the first 13 months of occupation that 20-something thousand people had died. And they said, look, that's so out of whack with what these 2 Lancet studies are saying. And that's just not true. They're not very far out of whack. First of all, it was Iraq governmental employees from Saddam's era that was doing the interviewing, and we're pretty sure they didn't get complete reporting of deaths. We're sure of that for 2 reasons. One, the overall death rate they came up with was about half the overall death rate we came up with before the invasion. And at the end of this study, the UNDP study you cite, the lead researcher, Jan Pedersen, was skeptical about this mortality data, so he sent the interviewers back to the exact same houses and had them just asked about deaths under 5. And lo and behold, when people met these interviewers the second time and were a little more comfortable, they reported 50% more deaths on the second interview as they did the first. So the researchers know their death estimate was a gross underestimate. And in the first year of the occupation, the death rate was very low compared to the second year. In fact, in our study that came out in 2004, there were twice as many violent deaths in the last 6 months of the occupation that we studied as there were in the first 12 months. So the two studies actually only differ by a factor of about 2, and the UNDP study, which was not about mortality, knows that it was a gross underestimate of deaths.
How do we know that the people, or what evidence do you have that the respondents to your survey were actually telling the truth about the deaths they reported?
That's a good question. At the end of the interview, when interviewees didn't know this was coming, if people had reported a death, most of the time the interviewers said, "Oh, and by the way, can I see the death certificate?" And 92% of the time, the interviewees could walk back in the house and come up with a death certificate. So it's just not plausible that people were making these up.
There'll be an assumption, perhaps not unreasonable, that this study, your study, is politically motivated, that really you've done the study because you're opposed to the US and Allied presence in Iraq.
Well, that's just not true.
You're not opposed to the US presence in Iraq?
Actually, the majority of the first authors I know were in favor of the invasion of Iraq, of the 2004 study. There's a new author on this time. I can't tell you what the split would be. You know, I've done this sort of study in Rwanda and Sierra Leone and Congo, and I'm opposed to people dying, full stop. I'm opposed to people dying in Iraq. And so, of course, it seemed that way, but every single study you've ever read in the public health arena is done by people who are opposed to whatever that problem is. No one who studies measles is sort of sympathetic to that poor little virus that is so viciously attacked by our immune system. I mean, most people who study anything say this is a problem and we want to reduce that problem. It happens that war is innately political. So for us to be saying that a lot of people have died here and this is really unacceptable brings us into a political realm that very few public health studies do. But that does not mean that we are motivated by sort of manipulating one group of people or one political party. In particular, in my country, essentially both parties have exactly the same position on the war and did from the beginning and did now. And so I'm really not sure what political motivation would affect who. When
Tony Blair and George Bush and John Howard dismiss your research, what's your response to that?
I think politically they feel they have to, and that it's not a scientific comment, it's a political comment. And it's quite ironic in that when I did a series of mortality surveys in the Congo and came up with an estimate in 2001 that 2.5 million people had died from that war, Tony Blair stood on the floor of Parliament and quoted our results. Colin Powell quoted our results when Joseph Kabila came to visit Washington. And for them to dismiss the exact same methodology now is somewhat inconsistent.
What's the point of publishing this research?
I think there are 2 points. The first point is that a lot of people have died in Iraq. And as a preemptive war, as a war undertaken by choice, when all is said and done, when the people in Australia and the people in the United States look back 5 years from today and say, was this venture worthwhile? We need to know the costs and the benefits of this venture. And one of the huge costs is how many people have died. And for us to be consistently downplaying that by a factor of 10 prevents us from, I think, justly evaluating this venture. And for political leaders to be talking in swaggering tones, saying things like, better we're over there fighting them than they're over here fighting us, I think is exceedingly inappropriate at a time where virtually every extended family in Iraq has lost someone. We think 2.5% of the population have died. And at this moment in history, it's really, really important for the political leaders who began this venture to be expressing contrition.
And we did try to secure an interview with the most trenchant critics of the survey, the people behind the website Iraq Body Count. I was told that as volunteers they were too busy keeping their data up to date, and to call back when the war is over.